A lot of the old rabbis, they got that thinking from Psalm 90 when it says, for 1,000 years in your sight are but as yesterday when it is past. And so they took this idea to mean that each a day to the Lord it corresponds with 1,000-year period of human history. We see Peter in the New Testament, he kind of plays off of that idea. And he says, in regard to the return of Jesus, because a lot of people were saying, Jesus, he's not coming back. Things are going on as they always have been. Nothing is changing. And then Peter tells them, don't over this fact. Remember that with the Lord, one day is as 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is one day. And so that's where they got that thinking. It was common in the time before Jesus. It was common during the time of Jesus, and that thinking was common even well past Jesus for at least a couple hundred years. And that's why in Revelation 20, we see John talking about, when Jesus comes back, that Satan is bound for 1,000 years, that those of us who have died or are raptured, that we come and we reign with Jesus for 1,000 years. And he mentions 1,000 years, I think 6 times in Revelation. And so the question I asked last week was, did John have that idea that his contemporaries, and those before him had, that 1,000 years was as a day, and that when Jesus returns, that the 1,000-year reign of Christ is actually looked at as a type of Sabbath, that the Sabbath rest that Israel partook in every week, it was pointing towards the ultimate Sabbath rest when Jesus returns and he reigns for 1,000 years. And we left off on, and I showed one slide that one of the rabbis, he even broke it down into these 2,000-year periods, that there were 2,000 years before the law or before Israel, and that would be from Adam to Abraham. They sometimes refer to that as the age of chaos. And then there was a 2,000-year period with the law or with Israel, and that would be from Abraham to Jesus. And then there would be another 2,000-year period under Messiah, or under the grace of Messiah, under Jesus. And, no matter how you figure it, if you do the math on these 3 2,000-year periods, we're at the end of the final 2,000-year period, the one with Jesus. And so no matter how you slice it, we're in the final seconds of the 6th day, so to speak. And so what signs precede the millennial Sabbath, or, precede Jesus coming back? The Old Testament talks about this. And I think we looked at this last week, but Hosea chapter 6, and this is speaking of Israel. It says, "Come, let us return to the Lord, for he has torn us that he may heal us. He has struck us down that he will bind us up." And then it says, "After 2 days, he will revive us. On the 3rd day, he will raise us up that we may live before him." In other words, what they're saying is, well, there's no period that we can look back to where this applies to some time in Israel's history. And I think what's happening here is that they're using that day as 1,000 years theory. And so basically what this verse is saying is that after 2,000 years, he will revive us, because we know even, shortly after Jesus died, by and large, the Jews in Israel have rejected Jesus as their Messiah. Not everyone, but a large majority of them. I know the early church was started by Jews, but a majority of them didn't believe Jesus as their Messiah. And so in the Old Testament, we see that that was foretold. And it says that they will return to the Lord after 2,000 years. And then on the third day, which I believe is referring here to the 1,000-year reign of Christ, which is, the final 1,000 years of this, I don't know what you want to call it, this present age, I guess, that God is going to raise them up. And we see Paul, he talks about this in Romans chapter 11, when, he's talking about, is God done with the Jews? And Paul says, no, he's not. That their rejection meant, acceptance for us as Gentiles. And he says, I do not want you to be unaware of this mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. And in this way, all Israel will be saved, as it is written, the deliverer will come from Zion. He will banish the ungodliness from Jacob, and he will be my covenant with them when I take away their sins. So this is talking about, when he says all Israel will be saved, he's pointing back to that, God's going to raise them up on the third day. And, there's a lot of parallels between Jesus and the nation of Israel. Jesus was in the tomb and he was raised on the third day. Likewise, Israel, they've rejected him for 2 days, but on the third day, he's going to raise them up, just as he was raised on the third day. Then what I want to look at is in the Old Testament, in Zechariah chapters 12 through 14, those deal with the events that unfold right before Jesus comes back. It's often overlooked, but there's some really interesting things that are mentioned there. In Matthew 23, we see Jesus, he's talking to Jerusalem, or to the Jews. He's saying, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, the city that kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to it. How often would I have gathered your children together as a hen gathers her brood under her wings, and you were not willing? See, your house is left to you desolate. For I tell you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." So Jesus isn't going to come back until that happens. And so Zechariah chapter 12, it talks about that, when that veil is removed from the eyes of Israel and they see Yeshua, that he was their Messiah, the one that they rejected, the one that they despised and killed. And Zechariah 12 says, "And I will pour out on the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem a spirit of grace and pleas for mercy, so that when they look on me, on him whom they have pierced, they shall mourn for him as one mourns for an only child, and weep bitterly over him as one weeps over a firstborn. And on that day, the mourning in Jerusalem will be as great as the mourning for Hadad Rimmon in the plain of Megiddo." And then a couple chapters later in Matthew 26, it says, "And when they had sung a hymn," I think talking about Jesus and his disciples, it says they went out to the Mount of Olives, which is interesting. Keep that in mind. It says, "Then Jesus said to them, you will all fall away because of me this night, for it is written," and then he quotes a passage in Zechariah, which is Zechariah 13, and it says, "I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep of the flock will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee." Peter answers him, "Though they all fall away because of you, I will never fall away." Jesus said to him, "Truly I tell you, this very night before the rooster crows, you will deny me 3 times." Peter said to him, "Even if I must die with you, I will deny you." All the disciples said the same. And So here we see Jesus, he quoted an Old Testament passage, one that we're looking at, Zechariah 13, when it says that I will strike the shepherd. Basically, that's when God, crucified, gave up his only son. The sheep of the flock will be scattered. And here Jesus applies it to his disciples. But in Zechariah 13, I believe it's talking about the nation of Israel, or the Jews as a whole. And so Zechariah 13, this is after the Jews, they see Jesus for who he is. And it says, on that day, there shall be a fountain opened for the house of David and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, to cleanse them from their sin and uncleanness. And then a couple verses later, this is what Jesus quotes, a couple hundred years later, when he's talking to his disciples. He says, awake, O sword, against my shepherd, against the man who stands next to me, declares the Lord of hosts. Strike the shepherd and the sheep will scatter, and I will turn my hand against the little ones. And so when he talks about, the sheep scattered, some people think it's referring to, or some scholars think it's referring to, the time after the temple was destroyed in 70 AD, that the Jews, they were dispersed across the earth. They weren't in Jerusalem. And it wasn't until 1948 that they were actually returned to Jerusalem. So it was about 1900 years that they were scattered. And here it says, in the whole land, declares the Lord, 2/3 shall be cut off and perish, and 1/3 shall be left alive. And I will put this third in fire and refine them as one refines silver, and test them as gold is tested. They will call upon my name, and I will answer them. I will say, they are my people, and they will say, the Lord is my God, or Yahweh is my God. So God isn't done with the Jews. One day they're hardening, it will be lifted from them, and they'll see Jesus for who he is. And this story of Israel, at first rejecting Jesus, and then one day they see him for who he is, that mirrors the story of Joseph and his brothers. Just like the song talked about. There's this, I found this because I knew there were parallels between Jesus and Joseph. Like Joseph was a type of Christ, or he was a type of the Messiah. He was a foreshadowing of the future Messiah, just as David also was. And a lot of the ancient Jews, they knew that David and Joseph were both types of the future Messiah. What they didn't understand was they thought that when Jesus came, they didn't see him coming in two phases. They didn't see his first coming, and then he would go up to heaven, and then later on he would return again to defeat his enemies. They thought that was all going to happen at once, and that's partly why they rejected him. But here in this document, and I don't know too much about Jews for Jesus, what type of organization they are, but I think this is good here, and it lists all of these different things about the parallels between Joseph and Jesus. And it talks about one of them here. I think it's the third from the last one, that his brothers were troubled when they met him. If you remember Joseph's brothers, they didn't like him because he was Jacob's favorite son, and Jacob gave him this colorful coat. And then Joseph had a dream that basically said that his 11 brothers would bow down to him. And his brothers didn't like that. And so one day they were out and he basically got sold into slavery. And he ended up in Egypt as a slave. He ended up working his way up to like second in command after Pharaoh. And then later on, some years later, there was a famine in the land, and Joseph knew about it. He knew to prepare. God had given him, the ability to interpret the dreams. And he knew that the famine was coming, and it affected all the land. And then his 11 brothers come to Egypt looking for food, and they ask him for food, not knowing that that's their brother. They thought he had died. And, he reveals himself to his brothers, and it says that they weep after they realize that, Joseph was still alive. And that mirrors what happens in Zechariah 12, when it says that there's weeping in Jerusalem because they understand that Yeshua was the one that was sent to save them. And then Paul in Romans, he likens that to an olive tree, that we, the Gentiles, are grafted into the olive tree, and that some of the branches were broken off so that we could be grafted in. And the natural branches were the Jews, were Israel. And he says at the end, and even they, if they do not continue in their unbelief, will be grafted in. For God has the power to graft them in again. For if you were cut off from what is by nature a wild olive tree and grafted contrary to nature into a cultivated olive tree, how much more will these, the natural branches, be grafted back into their own olive tree? So we as Gentiles are grafted into the olive tree. And then Jesus is going to graft the natural branches, which would be Israel, back into that tree. And so what happens after they're grafted back in? Then we read on. What I'm doing is I'm taking you through Zechariah 12, 13, 14. And here we get to Zechariah 14. After the Jews are grafted back in, then, the day of the Lord happens, which is basically when Jesus returns. So after they're grafted back in, then he returns. And it says in verse 3, then the Lord will go out and fight against those nations as when he fights on a day of battle. On that day, his feet shall stand on the Mount of Olives that lies before Jerusalem on the east. And the Mount of Olives shall be split in two from east to west by a very wide valley, so that one half of the mount shall move northward and the other half southward. And you shall flee to the valley of my mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach Azal, and you shall flee as you fled from the earthquake in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah. Then the Lord my God will come, and all the holy ones with him. So remember when Jesus told his disciples that when the shepherd is struck, the sheep will scatter. He said that on the Mount of Olives. And then we see here that when he returns, it's on the Mount of Olives. And also in Acts chapter 2, when Jesus ascends to heaven on a cloud, he did so on the Mount of Olives. And then when he returns, his feet are going to touch down on the Mount of Olives. And then the rest of chapter 14 goes and talks about, him defeating his enemies. And then at the end, it said, everyone who survives of all the nations that have come against Jerusalem shall go up year after year to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, and to keep the Feast of Booths. And if any of the families of the earth do not go up to Jerusalem to worship the King, the Lord of hosts, there will be no rain on them. So we see after Jesus comes back that we celebrate the Feast of Booths, talked about in Leviticus 23. And those nations that don't celebrate it, that they get no rain. And then it says that there shall be a plague with which the Lord afflicts the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. And then it says, this shall be the punishment to Egypt and the punishment to all the nations that do not go up to keep the Feast of Booths. So here we see, even after Jesus comes back, that we're required to keep this feast, and that if we don't, there's punishment. And so that's an interesting thing to think about, that even after Jesus comes back, that there's punishment handed out to nations and people that don't, partake in this feast. What? Go ahead. And then, so the 1,000-year reign of Jesus, it's not the new heaven and the new earth. There's a lot of schools of thought, I guess, that believe that when Jesus returns, that all wickedness is done away with, and that that the eternal state is ushered in. But I don't think that's the case. And I think Zechariah 14 kind of blows a hole in that theory. And so this is how I view it, is that the day of the Lord ushers in the day of the Lord. It's kind of like one of those little nesting dolls that the day of the Lord reveals the day of the Lord, or the 1,000 years of Jesus. So just as an overview, shortly before Jesus returns, the veil over Israel's eyes are lifted. Jesus returns with his holy ones to defeat his and Jerusalem's enemies. And then I believe that's when the marriage supper of the Lamb takes place. And then it's the 1,000-year reign of Christ. And that differs from the eternal state, maybe, or the new heavens and the new earth. The 1,000-year reign of Jesus is different from the new heaven and the new earth. And then Jesus talked about this. It's recorded in 3 of the Gospels that Jesus says that he is the Lord of the Sabbath, which I think is him referring to he rules during the final 1,000 years. And we see this 3 times in Matthew 12, Mark 2, and Luke 6. And he says to them, the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath, which means he is king during the millennium. And so what is life like in the millennium? I think we would be surprised, because a lot of times I think we can confuse the final 1,000 years and then the new heaven and the new earth as if they're the same thing. And that's not necessarily true. And there's some interesting things that once you dig into this, your view, because I think we think that when Jesus comes back, everything's going to be perfect. And I don't think that's the case. I think life is a lot better than what we experience now, but it's not yet perfect. And we see that in Zechariah 14, that there are nations or people that don't, keep the Feast of Booths or celebrate it. And then God sends them plagues. And this is during the millennium. It has to be during then, because I don't know when else it hasn't ever happened in in history. There's no time we can point back to and say, yeah, this is when this is talking about. It's a future event. Isaiah chapter 2, it talks about in the latter days, it talks about what's going to happen. And I think this section is talking about the 1,000 years. It says in verse 4 that he shall judge between the nations. So Jesus, he rules with the rod of iron. And it says he will decide disputes for many peoples, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. So that it is a time of peace. And the weapons that we use for war, it says that they're turned into tools to cultivate the earth. Instead of killing one another, we're growing crops and probably sharing with one another. And, we're not at war anymore. And this is kind of a direct shot at the powers of darkness that we see from Genesis chapter 6, the sons of God. Because if we look in the book of Enoch, it talks about the sons of God, that they taught us certain things. And Azazel, he was the one that taught humans how to make weapons. So he took our sinful nature and then he kind of cranked it up by giving us weapons. Like, here, go ahead. Now you guys can kill each other. And so he's responsible for that evil in the earth. And that's why his name is mentioned on the Day of Atonement. There were 2 goats that were sacrificed. One of them was sacrificed for Yahweh. And then the other one, it says, was for Azazel, and he was sent off into the wilderness. So the high priest would ascribe all of the sins of the people and place it on that goat, and that goat would be sent out into the wilderness. Basically saying, like, the sins that humans create, a lot of that blame and responsibility can be placed on these fallen sons of God, or these fallen watchers. And then Micah chapter 4 says almost exactly the same thing that Isaiah 2 does. And scholars, debate which one was written first, because one of them is obviously using the other as inspiration. And I think most scholars agree that Isaiah was written first and then Micah after. But it says almost the exact same thing, that their swords will be turned into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. And then Isaiah 65 is really, really interesting, because it says, for behold, I create a new heavens and a new earth, and the former things shall not be remembered or come to mind, but be glad and rejoice forever in that which I create. For behold, I create Jerusalem to be a joy, and her people to be gladness. And I will rejoice in Jerusalem and be glad in my people. No more shall be heard in it the sound of weeping or the cry of distress, nor shall there be an infant who lives but a few days, or an old man who does not fill out his days. For the young man shall die 100 years old, and the sinner 100 years old shall be accursed. They shall build houses and inhabit them. They shall plant vineyards and eat their fruit. And they will not build and another inhabit. They shall not plant and another eat. For like the days of a tree shall the days of my people be. And then later on in verse 25, it says, and the wolf and the lamb shall get together. And we know this is not talking about a time in the past. There aren't people that die at 100 years old and they're considered, young. So this is talking about a future time. And I think it's talking about the millennium or the final 1,000-year Sabbath. Because we know that there's no time in history where someone died at 100 years old and was considered a young person, except for time before the flood. So what's interesting here, though, is it says I create a new heaven and a new earth. So he's talking about a new heaven and a new earth, but then he says that there's people dying here. So I'm not really sure how to interpret this or how to take it, because I don't believe there's death like that in the new heaven and the new earth. But I do think that there is death in the 1,000 years, not for those who have been resurrected, but for those that survived at the end of the tribulation, that they still marry and they have children. And so in a weird way, Isaiah is like kind of blurring the new heaven and the new earth with the 1,000 years. And I'm not really sure why. But I know, just based off of other prophecies and things, like, for example, the angel of the Lord, they blurred the angel of the Lord with Yahweh himself. You know, there was a blurring there where they were the same person, but I think most didn't get it. And then with the prophecies of Jesus's first and second coming, those were blurred in the Old Testament. And so here I see something similar. Like it's blurred, and I'm not sure why. It's just something to keep in mind. So some interesting things about the millennium is Satan is bound. We rule with Jesus there. We keep the Feast of Booths. Punishments and plagues are handed out for those that don't keep it, which then means that not everyone in the millennium is a believer. We see in Isaiah 65 that death still happens. Weapons of war are fashioned into tools for cultivating the earth. And then we know from Revelation that Satan is let out at the end to deceive the nations. And so the people in the millennium can be deceived. What lies beyond the millennium? The eighth day, really quickly. Leviticus 23, when it's talking about the Feast of Booths or the Feast of Tabernacles, it says on the first day that you celebrate it, that's on the 15th day of the 7th month. So that's 5 days after the Day of Atonement. It's the first day. It was a week-long celebration. And the first day was a holy convocation, which we know is like a rehearsal. So I think the first day is symbolic for the millennium itself. And then it says, for 7 days, you shall present food offerings to the Lord. And on the 8th day, you shall hold another rehearsal or another holy convocation. So the 8th day is what happens after the millennium, that it's the start of a new day.
Scott,
or a new, I don't know. Yep.